Welcome to Conversations from the Edge of Consciousness. I'm your host, Christine Madera. For me, and possibly for you, the inner world of consciousness has always been much more real and way more fun than the so-called real material world. Growing up, I thought I was alone in this, but I'm not. There are a lot of us, and far too many have no one to talk to who shares this experience. I've been lucky to cultivate a community of friends who love to talk about the energies, ideas, and vibrations that are pushing the edges of our own consciousness, as well as our collective consciousness. In Conversations from the Edge, we share our conversations with you. Welcome to Conversations from the Edge. This is your host, Christine Madera, and we are here today again with Jana Roemer. So Jana has synthesized 20 years of study and 13 years of teaching her two great loves, astrology and yoga nidra, to create astro nidras, which is a lying down meditation that begins to move astrological energies through your body. And she also has built a virtual temple called Attuned to the Moon, where you find astrology embodied and other practices that really help to link you in real time to the planetary positions of the moment. So it's very exciting and a whole different way of experiencing astrology and the body and yoga. So welcome, Jana. It's nice to have you back.
Well, thank you so much for having me back. It's so fun talking to you.
Each astrological sign has its energy and its place in the body, which we're going to get into, but each one also has its own theme for personal development, its own archetype, and different things attached to it that you can use during that time of that astrological passage to really begin to amplify how it works in your body and in your mind and in your energy. So can you talk more about that and take it away and explain what that is and how we use it?
So one of the things that I fell in love with when I really started to understand astrology is that the stars and the planets are essentially your life coach.
Yeah.
They draw a map over the course of a year of 12 areas of your life. And within those 12 areas, there's an infinite number of ways to look at it. And so that's where astrology becomes really personal. Yet within that infinite number of ways, each sun season, so in this case, we're going to be talking today about the transit of the sun in Aries. So in that sun season, there is a archetype that, the psychologist Carl Jung used to teach a lot about. A lot of his work is about archetypes. And what he taught was that these archetypes live deep in I think he actually used the word unconscious. I describe it and understand it through the subconscious mind, but they live deep in our psyche, essentially. And during the transits, these particular archetypes start to gain strength within us. And so if I were to give you an image or a metaphor to play with, if you could imagine this dormant archetypal energy inside your body, that it's actually these, and it's not, but just pretend that it's these little tiny magnet pellets, and they sit dormant until the planets activate those magnet pellets, and all of a sudden they stand up higher in your body, or they start to move and activate in your body and have you kind of flavoring your perspective and flavoring your responses and flavoring your interactions with people. And
wow.
And at first I was like, oh, I don't really know. And then as I go through the seasons, every year, again and again, I'm like, wow, the whole entire collective is on board with these archetypes. It's just that we're not having them illuminated in a way that we understand them, because lots of people hear astrology and they're like, oh, woo woo, like Mercury has anything to do with my computer, right?
Yeah.
And it doesn't really compute, because it's so far out there. Like actually, quite literally, the planets are so far out there that it becomes easy to detach or to disassociate that they could have any effect on us.
Yeah.
But you'll see if people choose to follow it, you'll see it's actually embedded in our societal rhythms.
Well, I'm excited about that, to go through this for the year and actually work with it. Because I know for me, when I I look at kind of what we had just gone through or what's upcoming, like I always notice that I'm right in there with those things. So I like that you talked about it, like the magnets are activated so that you're moving through those things in along with the planetary energy, but how much better it would be to be able to do it with awareness and intention, and to use each planetary transit through the sun as, in the way that it's most designed to help you.
Right. That's exactly it. And what's so cool is when we do see it in advance, we can harness it. We can see ourselves before we're triggered. We can anticipate our challenges, and we can precede our week or our weekends with perhaps different conversations or different self-care practices, or we know that it's a time maybe that you just want to stay in the house because it could get pretty punchy out there,
Yeah.
So what I think is really interesting about Aries season is that this year, so it always starts on a slightly different day because it's the Gregorian calendar year is not actually perfectly aligned with the speed that it takes planet Earth to travel around the sun. So that's why we have leap years to make up for it. And it's an imperfect system. And so we see Aries season anywhere from the 18th to the 22nd of March. And the beginning of Aries season is, if we look at last year, was when all the lockdowns began. And so now we're going back over these same degrees in the sky with the sun, at least, and seeing it from another refreshed, reorganized perspective. So for all the people that just got into astrology last year because it kind of went viral along with now it'll be cool to see it.
Well, and I want to just touch in because there's something that you said in one of the two of our last podcasts, and I'm not sure which one it was, but that 2020 was, say, the disruption of endings as things began to dismantle, and that 2021 was the disruption of beginnings as all kinds of new energies gain momentum. And so it's exciting to kind of go through the year with that in mind, because everything really does seem so fresh right now, even if we're all still locked in our houses.
And who knows how long that's going to go on for, because we have some astrological indicators that we're not getting out anytime soon, which nobody wants to hear that. Nobody wants to hear that. But I don't think that hiding it or skirting around it helps our mental health, really. If we are a little bit prepared that, the way that I see this is Saturn, which is the planet of boundaries and restrictions and constriction. It's in Aquarius, and Aquarius is our freedom. And so we have this, although Saturn rules Aquarius, and they can get along really quite well, given the overall circumstances of what's going on in the world right now, it makes sense that while Saturn is transiting Aquarius, we would experience a little bit of boundaries or restrictions on our freedom.
Okay. And so, and that, because it's a transit there, there's an endpoint to that. So that's the nice thing about astrology, is everything is in motion. And so the things that are happening, they have a movement through and an ending. And so just keep that in mind, and keep the hope in mind if you're listening to this and thinking, oh my God, I can't stay in my house for another 6 months. This too shall pass.
Yes. And the astrology along with that is showing that it's going to be different than before, because the overarching theme of this year is what I was mentioning, is this Saturn Uranus square. And Uranus is upheaval, disruption, unexpected, shocking, spontaneous, but it's also awakening. So as we awaken to more of what is happening, and forget about the global scale, just look at what's happening in you and in your life. And yesterday I did a reading for this woman who said, well, everybody is having a hard time with COVID. It's been the absolute best year of her entire life, because she didn't ever realize that she needed time alone.
Wow. I'm kind of there with it, having been a really good year in many ways. In some ways, it was a very different year, and a lot had shifted, but a good year in a lot of ways. And a lot of people I've talked to who have kind of been able to find something that had been missing or let go of things that were no longer helpful and make some pivots and shifts, it has been a real blessing because it's something that has kind of forced people to take a look at what they were doing and say, this works, this doesn't work. How do we reemerge from this or move through this like a chrysalis as
Yeah,
opposed to a prison?
I love that. That's exactly, yes. Yeah.
So we are starting this with Aries, which a lot of people may not know. I didn't know until a few years ago was the beginning of the astrological year. And so what does that really mean if we're thinking about the beginning of an astrological year and the beginning of that in our body and in our psyche? Like, how do we begin to look at that as an opening?
Well, the first day of Aries season is aligned with the spring equinox.
Okay.
And if we look at just the equinoxes and solstices, they initiate seasons. So they're on a cross if you were to map this in a 360-degree circle.
Mm-hmm.
And the spring equinox, that's in the northern hemisphere. Of course, the southern hemisphere is the fall equinox.
Mm-hmm.
But it's this moment in time where the day and the night is equal, where in the north I'm going to speak to, it's like the seeds have already been planted, and they're in some places, I'm in Canada, they definitely haven't been planted here yet. The tulips and the daffodils, but they're still under the snow.
Oh my
But
gosh.
from a conceptual place, a lot of seeds have already been planted in the depths of winter,
Mm-hmm.
and they start to spring forth to be seen. So we see this renewal coming.
Mm-hmm.
And when we look at the life cycle of the archetypes, the Aries archetype is the baby. It's the brand new, fresh baby, because the season right before is Pisces, and it's the elder. And so that
Okay.
transition point between Pisces and Aries is the bardo, that place between life and death and life again.
Mm.
Or I guess it's life, death and life again is
Mm-hmm.
what where it is. And so when we think of the spring and we think of birth, it actually is a time of rupture. To give birth to
Yeah.
anything, whether a seed is sprouting and breaking through soil or a baby is being born, there's a rupture, and there's tremendous power behind a rupture. Like Aries has so much power to it, and
Mm-hmm.
every sign has an element to it. And we use 4 elements in astrology, and I'll go into them in more detail as we go. But this is fire, and the specific type of fire of Aries is like the striking of a match. It's cardinal fire is the astro nerd speak, but it's the initiating fire. So the initiating fire of life, the initiation of a fire, like a match striking.
Mm-hmm.
And it's how we get things to begin. And when you look at that, if I take it to a seed, the amount of potential energy that it takes for a seed to sprout is more energy than it takes to grow a leaf, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Right. And to give birth is this primal, I mean, full takeover experience. Until you've done it, it's impossible to explain it. But
Right. Yeah.
there's a rupture, and the rupture is not only like in the physicality of birthing a baby, whether it's a C-section or vaginally, but there's also a rupture of the mother's identity, and there's a
Mm-hmm.
rupture of 2 into 3 into a family, and there's these ruptures. And so
When you say, the rupture and the the amount of force and stuff it takes to give birth, the image that comes to mind too, especially around birth, is that it's not something that you do; it's something that is done through you, and it's directed by your body. It's not something that you control. I mean, it's the perfect metaphor for opening up into something new that you don't do because you have this well-formed plan. You do, I mean, things are done through you. It's like this process, this awakening process in the body and in the psyche that's totally transformational, that's outside of your immediate control.
that's exactly right. And one of the signature characteristics of a strong Aries archetype is a
Mm-hmm.
very low impulse control.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
It's like low impulse control. And you think of a baby, there's no real impulse control. They don't pause to think, should I do this? They just, the force comes through and they do it.
Yeah.
Right. It's never like, is this socially responsible or is this respectful? No, it's this force comes through, this force of emotion or this force of need or this force of desire. And it comes through without thought. It bypasses the intellect.
Right.
And so what's interesting is that a lot of times in astrology, people will put intuition into the water signs, but I actually think it's more in the fire signs, because the thinking mind is not even registering at the speed which the fire is moving.
Oh,
And so,
interesting.
yeah, it's a really interesting part of them. And then you look at some of the other features of Aries is that they have a strong ego. They have a ego strength that is, okay, so I'm going to say this, and I know I'm going to offend some Aries, but let me keep listening. Let me take you all the way through this.
Okay. I'm not an Aries, so I'm not bothered. You go ahead.
I know. I just know, because every sign gets offended about something in some way,
Right.
you know?
I
But
know.
I think it's
do.
important to
Yes.
speak about the whole experience of a sign.
Yeah.
And so they have a very strong ego presence. And if you look at a baby, like I was just saying, they don't stop to think if what they're doing is going to disrupt anyone else. They just do it because they need it, and it has to be that way. And that's one of the gifts of Aries, is that they don't think so much. They get the urge, they jump in 2 feet, they go with it, and then they deal with the consequences later. And so they end up being risk takers, trailblazers. They end up being really good at getting started on things. They're really good cheerleading projects, like, yes, okay, everybody, let's go, let's do this, right? Because they are natural leaders because of this strong impulse or this strong urge to create or to be in that mode of creation. And so I always thought that was really interesting. And the other feature of this archetype is that because it's first, like it's the baby, it's the first sign, it's like the first baby. You know, they don't have an older sibling to take their cues from. And so they're not following the crowd. They're typically pioneers, they're trailblazers. I wouldn't say the word inventive is necessarily their domain. I'd give that more to Aquarius, but they are trailblazing in such a way that is basically unparalleled by any other sign. And so if you are working with an Aries, and this goes for all archetypes, is really understanding what their strength is so that we can relate to them through these strengths. And as a season, this mode of initiation, when we look at circadian rhythms in the body, the more commonly known circadian rhythm is the morning and night. Like as the sun rises, we get serotonin. As the sun goes down, we get melatonin. And the serotonin wakes you up and gets you in your moods for the day. And then melatonin puts you to sleep and gets you in your dreams for the night. Well, there's another circadian rhythm of our bodies in all mammals that is about our libido and our natural reproduction cycle. And so if you look into nature, what are they doing in the spring? Animals, they're mating in the spring, right? And this is this initiation. So not only are they the babies and are initiating life through their own life, but it's also this initiation of life through life force, through libido, through sexual energy, through, this really creative force that lives there. And so as a collective, whether you have Aries, sun, moon, or rising, or planets in Aries, or, we all have Aries in our chart somewhere. And so we all have access to this archetype somewhere.
And even if we don't have Aries in a significant part of our chart, we can all use the Aries archetype. We're transiting through that energy. And so being able to understand what that energy is, and like you were saying, the magnets wake up and be able to use it to get into the flow of that energy in our life however, wherever it is there, like new projects and different things. So how would a person be able to utilize that energy in their life, even if they don't have Aries in a particular, strong part of their chart?
Well, everybody has it in a strong part of their chart. It's
Okay.
just that most people look to planets to understand strength.
Mm-hmm.
But in the same way that I always think the more advanced yogi isn't the one that does a handstand, it's
Mm-hmm.
the one who can hold presence in discomfort. The yogi
Mm-hmm.
is the one who can remain compassionate under challenging circumstances. And it's more subtle, it's less seen, and we have to work harder to get it. But as we harness, or as we develop these traits within ourselves, we actually strengthen our character and we become more whole. And so somebody can have no planets in Aries, but if you
Mm-hmm.
look in the chart is broken into 12 pie pieces.
Mm-hmm.
These 12 pie pieces, and each of these pie pieces is called a house, and
Mm-hmm.
each house governs an area of your life. So for example, if somebody was a Capricorn rising,
Mm-hmm.
Aries would rule their fourth house, which is the home, which is your deep emotional experiences, which is your ancestry, which is your womb, or where you once
Okay.
spent time in a womb. And
Mm-hmm.
so everybody can personalize it to a different area of their life, specifically where the Aries archetype lives stronger.
Okay, very good. So if you look to see where Aries lands in your houses,
Mm-hmm.
then you've got a good idea of where those two energies come together and are magnified during this time of year.
That's right.
Okay.
And that is where astrology starts to get hyper personal. And this is why, like on the Tune to the Moon website, you automatically, if you sign up and as long as you have your birth time, when you go into your space, you can see your chart, because I refer people to it all the time. I'm like, okay, we need to get people understanding their own stuff
Mm-hmm.
so that you can get that better. Because let's say somebody was like, oh, Aries is all about initiation and creativity, and they keep trying to put it into initiation and creativity. But really, for somebody, it's actually the time to start writing, right? Because if it's
Oh,
in their
yeah.
ninth house, and it's the time to
Mm-hmm.
start writing. But they have had this idea that writing happens in the winter, because that's when it's
Okay.
winter and it's cold, and
Mm-hmm.
you sit by the fireplace, and then they have writer's block all winter. And then, they think of something else to do then. When the sun comes out, it's time to go hiking, but now they're squandering their prime writing time, you
Right.
know?
Yeah.
So,
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that makes
yeah,
sense. Very
yeah.
good. All right. So
So,
where is Aries in the body?
so Aries lives in the head, the face, the adrenals, the muscles. It actually also lives in the brain and the eyes. It's the adrenals and the adrenal glands, but for different reasons. The
Mm-hmm.
adrenal glands themselves belong to Aries. The fluid belongs to Mars. But
Okay.
Aries is ruled by Mars, so it's all together anyways. So
So
the
what would that mean then if Aries rules the adrenals and Mars rules the fluid? Like how would somebody who didn't really understand what that meant be able to understand it better?
Well, let's look at some of the traits of the Aries archetype. Is to jump in, to have this urge, to have not a lot of regard for consequences and just go for it without
Mm-hmm.
thinking. It's like this fast action, behavior. But it's also your ability to be assertive,
Mm-hmm.
your inner aggression, it's anger and rage, it's competition. And these are all acts that tend to have us producing adrenaline.
Okay.
Right. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's living there in our body. This adrenaline is coming through this archetype, but also Aries lives in your muscles. And so when we're using adrenaline, if you understand how let's just say about the parasympathetic and the
Mm-hmm.
sympathetic nervous system, if somebody goes into a state of fight or flight or freeze or fawn, so fawn would be, let's say I was in a really uncomfortable position
Mm-hmm.
and somebody was abusing their power, and instead of fighting back, I started to fawn over them. Like if I I'll use a real life example. I was working one-on-one with a male client, and I was in his house, and he decided to hit on me. And instead of calling him out and saying, "This is so wrong, I can't believe you're, like, this is what's happening," I was like, "Oh, you're so funny." I just kind of made it.
Okay.
I tried to make it more comfortable to be, it's really awkward, but I tried to make it more comfortable and complimentary of him and joke with it instead of be assertive about it.
Okay.
And then freeze is where people just totally freeze. Yeah. And you probably know when you freeze, you have this very visceral feeling move through your body. Like you're still being flooded with the hormones of stress. There's still adrenaline running through your system, but your muscles actually just like lock into place and you freeze. Maybe your eyes get a bit bigger, and then somebody else will run. And in all those different circumstances, the muscles are being flooded with blood. So when we're in trouble, when we're in a stress state, what the body does is it takes all of the resources away from the organs and it sends it to the extremities so that you can get out of there, It sends the resources to the muscles so that you can run or freeze or,
Yeah.
And so that's why these are all interconnected. And so we can look at our own nervous system responses during this time of the sun transiting through Aries and get to know ourselves. And let's say you decided that you didn't want to freeze anymore. You might notice during Aries season with this hyper awareness that our adrenal system and our muscular system are being activated. You might be a little bit more jumpy or who knows, like it might just show up a little different. And when we're observing it, then in the moment of observing the pattern, we can start to work with the pattern. And a highly developed Aries archetype is neither going to be aggressive or passive aggressive. It's not going to fawn or freeze or flight. It's going to stand steady in its center, like very much centered within themselves and be able to assert themselves. So that's a lot of the personal development work that we can do in there. And then there's other stuff too. Like we can look at, some people are really competitive. Some people don't have a competitive bone in their body, and maybe you need a little bit more competition, or maybe you need to temper the competition. Well, because the archetype is being activated through this time, you could self-reflect on that and decide, well, maybe I don't want competition in this area of my life, family or, partnership, but I would like to have some competition awakened in my career. Right. And so then you can choose to take it and actively and consciously guide it into a particular area of your life. And in the case, let's say, of somebody who doesn't really feel competitive, they might make a game for themselves where they're not competing for the sake of making someone lose, but they could practice competing with their own goals or competing with their own game, Yeah. And so then we can develop that within ourselves.
Wow. So that's a lot to work on during Aries season.
Yeah. I think it's just this observation of how we're running that strength and that impulse through the body. One common commentary on Aries is that they're self-centered. And I would love to just flip the script on that they're centered in self. It's such a simple flip. Like they're self-centered or they're centered in self. And how that shows up is something that we see in others or what we see in ourselves. To be centered in self means that we can center others. To be self-centered is to constantly be centering ourselves in every situation. And I think we really need to be more centered in self. So if you forgot about everything else I just said, and that was the only thing, like to be centered in self, then we can self-design what that means for us over the course of this time.
And that's exactly how you described that evolved Aries of not fighting or fleeing or fawning or anything, but really standing in the moment and in the center and of being in that stable presence. And so that really correlates to that with me.
Yeah. And to have an Aries in your orbit on your team who is centered in self, they are the best teammates. They are incredible partners, because that also leads us to two of the key features of every season are the full and the new moon, or the new and the full moon, whichever comes first. And in this case, always in Aries season, it's always the Aries new moon. And
Mm-hmm.
always in Aries season, it's always the Libra full moon.
Okay.
And when we move into the Libra full moon, the archetype is me, 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 me. And then you go and have the Libra full moon, and all of a sudden it's
Uh-huh.
like, wait, this is a we.
Okay.
I need to look outside of myself and see if I'm being overly selfish, or how I can be centered in myself instead in order to center another person in my life.
Okay.
So those are two of the big themes there. And I actually made a note about this Libra full moon because it's okay. So the astrology is actually easing up on us for a couple months.
Oh,
Which
yay.
is so nice. It's so nice. It's not totally easing up on us, but it is compared to the last 18 months.
Oh, good.
And the beginning of this Aries season actually starts like really, really soft with this compassionate social vibe to it. And then one day in, Venus moves into Aries. So now we've got a little bit more energy in Aries. And so it will start to heat things up. But what we'll see in the first few days is that we could potentially be surprised with new information on the table or events unfolding that inspire us to walk with more integrity and to revisit our boundaries and the structures that we operate within. And we could see our discipline arising naturally from within versus some external authority saying, hey, this is how you should discipline yourself. In the very beginning onset of this Aries season, if we're doing our Aries work, the self-discipline, which I think is really the only discipline that actually works,
Yeah.
like it's when it's derived from within, there's an opportunity for this really to rise as spring is upon us. The full moon is the first weekend of Aries season. It's the 27th and 28th. And I'm just going to say both because depending on your time zone, it will change slightly. So that first weekend. And there are major healing opportunities in our relationships on that full moon because we have Venus and the moon and Chiron, Chiron is a planet it's an asteroid, pardon me, that travels between the inner planets or the personal planets and out to the outer planets or the generational planets. And so it bridges these worlds of like deep inner torment to grand universal lessons. And
yeah, I've heard it referred to as the wounded healer.
Exactly. And so I look at it, that wounded healer having 3 octaves, one where you're just totally being tossed around in your wounds and you're sitting in the realm of blame and shame and it's their fault that life isn't going the way it's supposed to be and whatever. It's everybody else's fault but your own. And or whatever your core wound is, it's like activated. And then there's another octave of the Chiron archetype that is when you finally start to notice, oh no, if I think everybody's an idiot, maybe I need to look at that, right? Like maybe it's my perspective, maybe it's my projection. And so when it's in this expression, sometimes it can be described as like a dark night of the soul, because now all of a sudden your world starts to cave in on you and you're like, oh my goodness, my suffering is my responsibility. And lots of times people turn around and go right back into the suffering and blame because it's easier to blame somebody else than do themselves.
Sure.
But sometimes people spend a lot of time in there and it can look like depression or anxiety or you know, a lot of different expressions, insomnia. Or some people will take that and they'll take radical responsibility for their lives. They'll make some big changes. They'll really step up to their own personal responsibility. And those things that were once wounding us then turn into our wisdom. And that's where like this embodied wisdom becomes a place to center within ourselves from.
And that's what like Rumi talks about when he talks about that your wound is kind of where you open to the light and the light's able to come in when you're operating at that level of your core wound.
Yes. Yes,
Okay.
exactly. And in the mythology of Chiron, they talk about Chiron as the music teacher. And
Hmm.
you take that out into the tormented artist, like where some of the most beautiful songs come out of the deepest pain, like the breakups
Yeah.
or the, like that heartbreak that creates such gorgeous music. So,
Mm-hmm.
and then that music is this anthem of healing. I think of Alanis Morissette, I don't know if you,
Mm-hmm.
her album Jagged Little Pill, like she was angry and she was hurt and she took all of that and she made it into music that became one of the top selling female artists ever in the history of music. That album, it was global and huge and it was moving.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
that's just such a beautiful example of taking these wounds and elevating it to a place of wisdom. But yeah, so we've got this triple conjunction of Chiron, Venus, and the sun all together in Aries,
Mm-hmm.
opposite the moon in Libra. And it just has this signature of healing potential in it that might come through a little bit of conflict because Aries is ruled by Mars, and Mars
Mm-hmm.
is the bit of a warring planet, a little bit of a battle planet.
Mm-hmm.
But what this moon wants us to do is talk about it. It wants us to sit down with our partners, with our more intimate relationships or our contractual relationships. It could be professional, it could be creative, it could be collaborative, it could be
Mm-hmm.
co-parenting, it could be marriage, it could be roommates, any
Yeah.
relationship with a contract attached to it, and like talk it out. And so as I'm building this, I'm like, if people know and they have therapy sessions, they could pack a therapy session in on the Friday before, like on the 26th of March, just make sure you've got your therapy session booked so that you can like have a little bit more presence and a little bit more guidance to how you can bring some of these conversations into the realm of healing. So,
That's great to time your therapy with the astrology. That's a whole
oh,
another niche.
Oh, that's such a great thing to do. I'm a big fan of that. I think it's a great idea.
It really is. I mean, I might have to talk about that sometime.
Yeah. And like this full moon, really what it's trying to do is create a win-win-win for everybody. Like everybody
Mm-hmm.
comes out better because of it. But the thing is that we have to face ourselves. And that's really
Mm-hmm.
where relationship becomes sacred. And
Mm-hmm.
remember that Aries lives in the face. And
Okay.
so how we grow it is by facing ourselves and really looking at that. Yeah. And then there's this like beautiful ripple effect that comes off that full moon where it's like, okay, so you've had these conversations and
Mm-hmm.
there's some astrology that's saying you're going to be able to see through lies or deception. So
Mm-hmm.
that's part of it. But then there's this healthy establishment of boundaries that come out of it, this repurposing of how we engage in communication and really supportive alignment in purpose through this whole and all the way in through the beginning of April. It's like it's setting us up for having an increase in our clarity and our vision, our reputation, our responsibilities. And then shortly thereafter, on the 3rd of April, we get more Aries energy because Mercury is going to move into Aries. And so
Okay.
then it's going to heat up a little more.
Uh-huh.
And when it heats up, we're actually going to move into the realm of really great creativity, like really great. Like I would say the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th of April, like if you have a choice to dedicate some time to creative projects and creative ideation or that creative spark, like that's a really great time for it. And then the 9th is one of those like key days to watch because it's an
Uh-huh.
easy day to get triggered on. And so
Okay.
on these key trigger days, I just say like, don't skip your morning practice, wake up in the
Mm-hmm.
morning and set your mood. Like you consciously choose your mood for the day
Yeah.
because it's
Center in
really
yourself.
exactly. And the 9th, like don't miss it. Because it's a day where we can really easily slip back into some of our patterns or that maybe you
Okay.
feel like you're under psychic attack. Who knows what that is? If it's your own psyche or if there is a psychic attack, like who knows? But just be solid within yourself.
Okay.
And then after that, all the work that we did from the beginning of Aries season, now it starts to pay off starting on the 10th. And on the 11th is the new moon.
Okay.
And so the new moon is a little bit disruptive. It might feel like you're finding your flow and you're in your creativity and the relationships. Now you got your communication going on well. You've got boundaries in place. You've got, structure in your life there. And then on the new moon, all of a sudden it can feel like you're being swept away or that it's being taken away from you. But really what it is, it's one of these totally classic Aries cosmic urges. Like how you were saying in the very beginning, giving birth there's a force that comes through you. It's non-intellectual. And one of these forces is going to come through with that Aries new moon. And if we fight it, it can get really messy. And if we surrender to it and we open to it and we observe ourselves through it, then it's almost like we get our next marching orders.
So it's part of that disruption of the new energy that you were talking about for 2021.
Exactly. Exactly.
So it should be an exciting time.
It should be, and it should help progress us. We should see some progress around there. And so because that comes through with such a force, the letting go or the endings or the death process, metaphorically so, of course, is so much easier to accept and release and let go because this new life force has come through with the new moon that's more exciting than anything that was before. So that's a little map of Aries season. And of course, I have the Astro Nidras designed in such a way that you can just lay back and see this within yourself. Well, you can watch it. Yeah.
Very cool. So why don't you tell us just a little bit about that?
Yeah. So what I've created are essentially a series of practices that instead of, I guess I just talked about the astrology and talked about it all, but instead of relying on some kind of translator for the astrology, what these practices do is you lay down for this very restorative, restful practice of self-observation. And in the practice, I'm guiding you to where it is alive in the body. And through that guidance, it's like, okay, so in Aries season, for example, I have one that it's called the face off. And so you go into this really detailed, not a full body scan, but a face scan. And we really wake up the quality of presence in your face. And then it's a journey in there, like, what do you need to face in your life? Or I have this other one that is really helpful to get you to center in yourself. It's called Return to Your Home Frequency. And in this one, the way that the practice goes, you lay down, eyes closed, and then you imagine all these cords that are latched into you. And some of these cords, they're coming from you and they're latched into other things. But all of these cables and cords, they're essentially places where energy is leaking or it's being drained or drawn from you. And so the first phase of this process, we just use our imagination and we unlatch all of these hooks. And some of them you give it back and some of them you reel it in until all of a sudden you're in your own little sovereign bubble and nothing is pulling on you and you're not responsible for anything. And then we just go layer upon layer upon layer deeper until you find that place inside of you that only you can feel. And then when we're there, you just clean house, you set new intention, and you really center yourself right within. And then there's a couple other ones. I think this Aries season, there's 4 already, so there'll be 5. One is like the old programming. So this is for somebody who doesn't have Aries strong in their chart, and they're actually wanting to return to that innocence. You want to return to that purity that is this infant. And so this is for somebody that's like, oh my God, I have so many programs. I have so many beliefs. I have so many stories of how things should be. Well, this
Mm-hmm.
practice then goes in more into the psyche and helps you defrag those programs. So,
Wow.
yeah.
All right. And people
Yeah.
can get special pricing if they go and find you through conversationsfromtheedge.net. Is that true?
That's right. We have a special discount code for all of your listeners, and there's different passes, but we just did really simple, the expander pass. It gets you all the pre-recorded content that gets served up with the astrology. So when you open up the website, you get an astro update, but then you also only see the practices that are relevant for the astrology today. So you don't have to like sort through a bunch of stuff. You don't have to understand astrology, none of that stuff. It's done for you. And that's what's included in the expander pass. And your crew gets 50% off. So it's only $11 a month.
Wow.
And then, yeah, it's a great
deal.
It's a great deal. Yeah.
Yep. So you can find that in all of the links to reach Jana at conversationsfromtheedge.net and find your special codes and start and join the program, because it sounds truly fascinating. And I've done some of these meditations and they're just amazing. So thank you, Jana. I'm excited to talk in our next conversation about Taurus, because that's another really interesting energy that's supposed to be a little quieter this year, or quieter right now than our previous astrology. And I'm excited about a couple of months of quiet. So I'm looking forward to that one.
Me too. Thank you so much for having me.
This is your host, Christine Madera. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation from the edge of consciousness. You can find all our conversations at conversationsfromtheedge.net. You'll also find links to schedule a private conversation with me or any of my friends, as well as tools to help you expand your own consciousness and explore what's possible for you outside the boundaries of your current perceptions. Feel free to use this podcast to start your own conversation by sharing it with friends, on social media, in your blog, or even in your own podcast. And as always, live the adventure of pushing your own edge. It's the most amazing adventure there is.